So what we're going to do is we'll invite Father Benanti to give his remarks first, and then followed by Professor Hurlbert, and then we would like to open this up to question and answer. So with that, if you would join me in welcoming Professor Benanti.
Thank you very much. I'm really glad of this invitation. I have to excuse with you because my age is going greater. I want a new pair of glasses, and so probably I will switch from one to the other depending on the quality of the text. Well, the speech that Benedict XVI was supposed to give at La Sapienza University in Rome in 2008, although not delivered because of opposition from some faculty and students, is of fundamental importance for the relationship between faith and reason, between philosophy and theology, and for the role of the university in the search for truth. This speech followed in the footsteps of the famous Regensburg speech in 2006, in which Benedict XVI stressed the need for a broadening of horizon of rationality in order to face the challenge of the present. The Pope reiterated that faith and reason are not in opposition, but must complement each other, as was the case in the early century of Christianity and in the Middle Age. Reason, if it become, unquote, deaf to the great message that comes to it from faith, dries up and loses courage for the truth. Well, we have to recognize that there are no direct elements in the discourse that focus on relationship between faith and technology, or faith and science and technology, as for example in Caritas in Veritate. But this does not mean that there are not fundamental teaching to address this relationship, especially in its current problematic nature. Let me indicate here at least the three most urgent ones from the perspective of my research as a theologian dealing with technology and artificial intelligence. First, Turing convinced us that the machine will, in a sense, be like us when it succeeds in deceiving us. Turing test. We are not able to recognize what is the machine and who is the human. What does it mean today to search for truth with this technology? So we have an epistemological question. Second, in a season when along a subtle linguistic frontier, the machine, thanks to the computer disciplines, seems to humanize itself more and more every day, and man, thanks to neuroscience, understanding itself more and more as a biological way of functioning, what is the difference between something that works and someone who exists? Anthropological question. Third, what is the difference between intelligence, especially artificial intelligence, and reason? Museological question. Well, with these three questions, I would like to, in this brief reflection, to consider some element of this discourse that I believe are particularly significant for a dialogue between science and faith from a contemporary perspective. A first element to keep in mind is the use of the thoughts of John Rawls and Jürgen Habermas, two central figures in a contemporary political philosophy, each having contributed significantly to the field with their own theories and ideas. Both have explored fundamental questions concerning justice, democracy, and the role of rationality and discourse in political life, but from different perspectives. The reflection of these two authors are taken up by Benedict XVI as a premises for the role of faith in dialogue with reason, with a view to coexistence in a plural space. Well, we have to focus to the notion of public reason, that is based on the idea that the moral and political norms governing the collective life of the community must be potentially acceptable to all citizens. This form of public reason is, following Rawls' view, in fact a form of political liberalism. Rawls' public reason is not about a particular object, but rather about the limits of public debate when fundamental issues are at stake in a liberal democratic society. In particular, public reason concerns the constraint placed on the way we address one another in the institutional life of liberal democracy. The function of public reason is eminently political and aim to hold citizens together on fundamental issues of justice under condition of substantial neutrality and pluralism. To Rawls' idea, Pope complement the contribution of Jürgen Habermas. I start to quote. Sorry, the English translation is mine. Jürgen Habermas expressed, in my opinion, a broad consensus of current thinking when he said that legitimacy of a constitutional charter as a prerequisite of legality will derive from two sources: from the egalitarian political participation of all citizens and from the reasonable form in which political contrasts are resolved. Regarding this reasonable form, he noted that it cannot be just a struggle over arithmetical majorities, but must be characterized as a truth-sensitive process of argumentation. Still quoting, Wahrheit sensibles argumentations verfahren, end of quoting. The recent of Habermas' monumental essay entitled How eine Geschichte der Philosophie, published in 2019, that cannot be known by Benedict at that time, show well the evolution of his thought. In his long history, philosophy has appropriated themes and problems of religious thought, transforming and reformulating them into a secular vision. This is the roots that already Benedict XVI highlighted in the quotation of Habermas during that speech. In the great Habermas fresco, this work of domesticating the religious begins with the axial age, with the gradual separation of faith from myth, and with the birth of Greek philosophy, which at least in the West marks the beginning of a still living tradition. The culmination of the secularization process occurs in the Enlightenment and finds its fulfillment on the one hand in the thought of German idealism, from Kant to Hegel, and on the other in the works of David Hume. Philosophy finds its way rational foundation, independent background of faith. And here, science seems to emerge as a locus of truth in place of religion. But science does not question man's place in the world as is the traditional task of religion. So Habermas recognized the same core element that arise from the Benedict reflection. Philosophy, on the other hand, cannot proceed, Habermas argues, from this broader questioning that, already present in use in German idealism, is made explicit in a post-secular and post-metaphysical thought. To this position seems directly that part of the Pope discourse, which stressed the importance of relationship between philosophy and theology, which must not be separated but live in a fruitful bond as in the first century of Christianity. The de-Hellenization of Christianity, that is, its separation from its Greek roots, is seen as an impoverishment to be avoided. For contemporary liberalism, political principle must be justified by an appeal to public reason, and public reason, in the Rawlsian liberal tradition, exclude from the range of permissible arguments in politics those formulated by unreasonable people. Religious belief may be, in Rawls' perspective, be among them. In a sense, liberal public reason requires that public discourse be based on an institutional morality shared by all the citizens, and it's possible to think that this kind of mentality place too strict limit on those who place faith at the center of their worldview. At the same time, it must be admitted that what is reasonable and what is unreasonable is difficult to agree on. And here is the core element that arises from the Benedict perspective at the Sapienza speech. However, these premises of public reason as a problematic as ever today in a so divided and polarized society, the struggle to think common reason. I think that was really prophetic perspective, because in a so polarized society, what remains of public reason is a thin layer that is not able to sustain the social tension that arises in our community. Perhaps today, we need to set out again in a search of a form of public reason that I would like to label as a theme, that can be understood as a common substratus of openness to dialogue and confrontation. Today, the different groups that constitute plural society probably differ in what roles call their background culture and their general doctrines, starting with religion and its use on public sphere. But for roles, for example, communist was also general doctrines, because it gave a global perspective of action to the people that believe in it. So here we have a really interesting thing. In a roles perspective, we need public reason, but there is no possibility of having a thick public reason without these comprehensive theories that allow people to find an agreement on some point. So in the moment in which we subtract a public function of Christianity, we are subtracting also, at least in the Western democracy, the possibility to find an agreement in different points. Of course, this form of liberal democracy will be thin. A society that wants to rely only on an historical and scientific rationality, such as the one described by Benedict XVI in his speech, will have no choice but to rely on a subtle, thin, public reason that depends on the mere convergence of different points of view, often reached through the same form of modus vivendi. Look at the contemporary political debate in all the Western democracy. After the effect of social network polarizing society, what we saw is that they monetize what was the public reason, and in exchange we have just the space for a thin public reason, really divide, really difficult. Public reason is always based on a form of convergence. Those who disagree on their broader view can nevertheless agree in an effort to avoid attempt to impose those views in a law and opt instead for a legal system based on a public shared conception of justice and form of public inquiry and reasoning. But what is the role of Christianity in this liberal society? This is another element that arises from the speech of Benedict. The Sapienza speech is to be read with another contribution of Benedict XVI. The speech to the Bundestag on September 22, 2011, where he highlights how a positive reason, taken as an absolute values, diminish man and his ability to find a public agreement. So I simply would like to stress that it's not possible to read the Sapienza speech without the Bundestag and without the Lumen Fidei. These three elements, in my perspective, will enlighten the original contribution of the speech. So, let me quote from this speech. The same thing, however, I'm quoting, also apply to reason in a positivistic view, which is regarded by many as the only scientific view. In it, what is not verifiable or falsifiable does not fall within the realm of reason in the strict sense. Therefore, ethos and religious must be assigned to the realm of the subjective and fall outside the realm of reason in the strict sense of the word. Where the exclusive dominance of positivist reason prevail, and this is largest the case in our public consciousness, the classical source of knowledge of ethos and law are put out of play. This is a dramatic situation that affects everyone and about which public discussion is needed. Urgently inviting it is an essential intention of this discourse. End of quotation. From this element, it is, in my opinion, also possible to find a departure from Rawls and Habermas in the direction of Bokenford. Bokenford asks whether the Christian faith, in its internal structure, is a religion like any other, so that proper form in which it can present itself is that of public worship, a possible civil religion, or does it transcend previous religion? In that, its efficacy and realization lie precisely in breaking down the sacral form of religion and the public domain of worship, in leading men toward the rational temporal ordering of the world, that is, to awareness on their own freedom. I'm quoting Bokenford, Law and Secularization from Mother State to United Europe in Italian version, page 51-52. The question is not peregrine, and moreover, it could connect with the influential Hegelian philosophy, for which secularization is not the negation, but the realization of the content of revelation, thus with the incarnation of Jesus Christ. However, if this question implies answer inspired by a theological conception, the return of the political planes led Bokenford to ask, what does the state live on? Where does it find the force that sustains it and guarantees the homogeneity and the intrinsic regulative virtues of freedom, which it needs since the binding force drawn from a religion is not and can no longer be essential to it? Page 52. So also Bokenford, a simple highlight that if we lose the grip on a comprehensive theory as Christian, and Christianity is not a comprehensive theory alone, quoting the Sapienza speech, all the public system will be damaged by that. Until the 19th century, in fact, the Christian religious, although now outside the sacred conception of the state, constitute the binding link for the political order. In the 19th century, to fulfill the same function was the idea of nationhood. Today, that idea is in crisis as well. And since it does not seem possible to ground the bound of sovereignty solely around the formal expression of the legal state, because it seems clear that unifying bond must precede a public order that is endowed with a constitutional structure, I'm quoting Bokenford, how is it possible to get out of the contradiction whereby the state no longer seems able to guarantee on its own the prerequisites of freedom and plurality? In fact, the state cannot ground from itself deep values in claim to guarantee. So the solution to this contradiction lies in Bokenford's vibrant appeal to Christianity. It's up to Christians to rediscover the relationship with the rule of the law, the state that is indeed worldly and secularized, but in its secularity is the opportunity for freedom, from which one can proceed from constitution of public order that is appropriate to Christian values. On the other hand, Bokenford asked for another junction. What does the theological project of I mean the good and the order of truth mean politically? When God himself, with us man always again, and spite of its disappointment, take the risk of freedom, page 197, Italian edition. The reconciliation of the contradiction, then, is carried out on a level of political commitment of Catholics on the overcoming, not the dissolving, of the aporia between a worldly order in which the state professes and sometimes flaunt neutrality with respect to religious faith. Well, this position resonates not only in the wisdom passage of Sapienza speech, but again in those delivered at the Bundestag some year later. The speech, which as already mentioned, in my opinion, should be read in continuity, which was mentioned in the speech at Wisdom Point, is fundamental. The reconstruction of the foundation of reason in public space operated by Christianity. Start to quoting. How is what is just recognized? Throughout history, legal order have almost always been religiously motivated on the basis of a reference to deity. What among men is right is decided. Unlike other major religions, Christianity has never imposed on the state and a society a revealed law, a legal order delivered from revelation. Instead, it has referred to nature and reason as the true source of a law. It has referred at the harmony between objective and subjective reason. An harmony, however, that presupposes both spheres being grounded in God's creating reason. With this, Christian theologians become associated with a philosophical and juridical movement that had been formed since the 2nd century before Christ. In the first half of the 2nd pre-Christian century, there was an encounter between natural social law, developed by the Stoic philosopher and influencer master of Roman law. End of quotation. To this element must be added a further argument in the Sapienza speech that amplify the scope of this concept. The influence exerted in history by Christian thought and reflection. In this perspective, it's possible to hear an echo of the reflection that already appeared in what Karl Rahner proposed in his fundamental course on faith. I have an edition of that book with the preface of Joseph Ratzinger, in which I highlight some of that element. The historical in Benedetto Croce, in his writing, Why We Cannot Call Ourselves Christians. So the effectiveness that Christianity had in the history is an element of truthworthy of the reflection of Christianity. This idea of deepening itself in the history, I think, is one of the core elements that we have to look in the Sapienza speech, to look the perspective that Benedict XVI left to ourselves. Well, the historical effectiveness of Christian reflection and its social influence make it not one source among many, but an indispensable element. It would be impossible to do philosophy as if the contribution of believing reflection had never been there. The completion of this process of reflection and contribution to believers' self-awareness of their unique and precipitous role in the plural public space will take place in the encyclical Lumen Fidei, signed by Francis and referred by him to the work of Benedict XVI. Let me quote: "It is therefore urgent to recover the character of light proper to faith," I cut a piece, "capable of illuminating the whole of human existence." I jump another phrase. "Faith is born in the encounter with the living God, who calls us and reveals his love to us." Again, "Transformed by this love, we receive new eyes. We experience that there is a great promises of fullness in it, and the glimpse of the future is opened to us. Faith appears as a light for the road, a light that directs our path throughout time. On the one hand, it proceeds from the past. It is the light of a foundational memory." I jump a phrase. "At the same time, however, since Christ is risen and draw us beyond death, faith is a light that comes from the future, that open up before us great horizon and lead us beyond our isolated I, or myself, to the breath of communion." Lumen Fidei number 4. And again, "Can the Christian faith offer service to the common good about the right way of understanding truth?" I'm still quoting him. "The heart, in the biblical sense, is the place where we open ourselves to the truth and love and let them touch and transform us in the deepest way. Faith transforms the whole person precisely. Insofar as they open themselves to love, it is in this interweaving of faith with love that we understand faith's own form of knowledge, its power of conviction, its ability to illuminate our steps. Faith knows insofar as it is related to love, insofar as love itself brings light. The understanding of faith is that which comes when we receive God's great love that transforms us inwardly and give us new eye to see reality." Lumen Fidei 26. At this level, and in this direction, is my opinion that we find the valuable contribution and the important legacy that this speech and reflection of Benedict XVI leave to Christians and university for the advancement of the search for knowledge and truth in a plural society. Benedict XVI states that the university was born precisely from the fruitful encounter between Greek thought and Christianity, which enabled Socratic questioning and the search for truth. The university, therefore, has the task of keeping awake the sensitivity to the truth to which the human mind aspires. I'm going to the end of my reflection, and I need to be back to the 3 questions that I highlighted at the starting of this reflection. And here we can return to the question which I opened this little reflection. For the epistemological question, the alliance of Christian thought with Greek philosophy in the form of reason expanded by the light of faith help us to recognize that the Turing test actually is simply a reversed Plato cave model. So Plato was used to say that it's not the shadow projected on the wall that give us the light. We have to go beyond the wall. And so, as encountered in the dialogue The Republic, one confused shadow for reality. So the posture that Benedict XVI's speech gives us to researcher is one posture that in this epistemological question help us to go beyond the limitation of actual debate. For the anthropological question, our faith, as in every changing epoch, has gone through, is called upon to make its contribution to continue answering the perennial question of what it means to be human. This mission is as urgent as ever in a season in which human rights are becoming more fragile and threatened every day. And I love to say that in the day in which there is a new document on human dignity, just pressed out by the Congregation of the Faith. For the gnosiological question, reviewing the history of ideas with a method similar to Benedict XVI's, we can recognize that the concept of intelligence, as used today, is the effect of an eclipse. I cannot use a different word today. The eclipse of teleological categories for the living after the advent of the scientific revolution. These issues is too long to be addressed here. However, we can recognize that after the eclipse of telos for the living beings, the only way to describe behavior that seemed to be not simple casual is intelligence, such as finding a solution to a survival problem for an animal. If we don't intend that an animal has his own telos, his own ends, we should use the word intelligence to describe something that is not just driven by causality. Such as finding a solution to a survival problem for an animal needed another label. Intelligence is now the term used to describe, for example, a plant's ability to adapt to the hostile environment and survive. All that Benedict XVI has taught us about reason, especially in its expanded form, find its natural calling here to bring a meaningful believing contribution to this generation's search for truth. The Pope invites reason to set out towards the truth, the good and God, without imposing faith, but urging it to discern the light that have arisen from the Christian tradition. This is the task incumbent on each of us, to paraphrase Peter's letter, to give an explanation to all who ask us the reason for that faith which is in us. Thank you very much.
Very much, Father Benanti. I'd like to now invite Professor Hobart to give his remarks, please.
So first of all, I want to say thank you very much to the organizers, to Father Kimes in particular, for having me here. I have to say that this is completely outside of my comfort zone, and I approach this assignment with trepidation, even terror. But nevertheless, it's been an extremely interesting undertaking. And for what it's worth, I think my comments follow on pretty well from Professor Benanti. So maybe I'm on the right track. Okay, so I'm going to try to manage two machines here since I can't quite see the screen over there. Okay, so in trying to figure out how to approach the small and yet massive task that was given to us, I found myself going back to my bookshelf to a few things, this small handful of things that I had read from Pope Benedict or Joseph Ratzinger from the past. And it struck me, thinking about this speech and also thinking about those texts, how extraordinarily his thought weaves between and interweaves these three key zones, which for me are areas whose interrelations I want to understand in political modernity, particularly in secular political modernity, and to which Pope Benedict offers a kind of critique that I hope to develop in a way that is resonant with Father Benanti's comments, but maybe takes it in a slightly different direction. And let me observe that these domains, the domains of politics, the domains of knowledge, and the domains of, let's say creativity, the relationship of the human to nature and of the human's relationship to his own creative power, are made sense of, are disciplined, we might say, into these kinds of distinctions. And Father Benanti's discussion of roles and to some degree of Habermas, I think follows these this delineation. I'm sorry that you guys can't see this. If you want to, I can see you. Oh, you can see mine. Okay, perfect. Okay, and yet this is a remarkable statement that comes at the end of that speech. Over and above his ministry as shepherd of the church, this is after having noted the importance of the autonomy of the university as responsible only to its search for truth. And its sort of secularity, its delineation from the role of the Pope, over and above his ministry as shepherd of the church, and on the basis of the intrinsic nature of this pastoral ministry, it is the Pope's task to safeguard sensibility to the truth, to invite reason to set out ever anew in search of what is good and true. I mean, this comes across actually as a remarkable appropriation, you might say, or one could see it as a transgression into the territory of knowledge, which is supposed to be the province of the university. And so it's this phrase, this quite interesting phrase that he developed, sensibility to the truth, that I want to dwell on. And this phrase he actually takes from Jürgen Habermas. Sorry, I'm not doing both at the same time, am I? Is this not working? There we go. Okay. I'm sorry. Okay. This was the distinction. This is the sort of foundational distinctions of modernity here. Here is that statement. You want to change it every time I change it? That would be fantastic. It turns out I can't walk and chew gum at the same time. Yes. So sensibility to the truth. That's what we're looking at. Okay. Good. So this is the phrase that I want to dwell on. And here's the sort of punchline, and you can tune out for the rest if you want to. It seems to me that those 3 bullet points that I put up a moment ago are organized around an aspiration to universality. That is the Rawlsian project, vis-a-vis justice and public reason. It is about the production of a space that is placeless. That is the project of science, in effect, of its claim to a special privileged kind of rationality that is displaced from position and culture and history, and so forth. And to this, Benedict offers a rejoinder, not so much of an alternative universality, although one could certainly argue that, but first and foremost of a provocation to unity. And this strikes me as a remarkable provocation. So let me develop that provocation. So number 1, secular politics and religious reasons. This is what Father Benanti walked us through extensively. And what I want to point to here, I want to offer the first few sentences of Rawls' A Theory of Justice as a kind of exemplar of, number 1, a kind of symmetry between the project of justice and the project of truth. That is the project of knowledge and the project of politics. That's excellent. Thank you. But as an exemplar of this project of universality and the kinds of distinctions that it entails. So justice is the first virtue of social institutions, as truth is of systems of thought. A theory, however elegant and economical, must be rejected or revised if it is untrue. And likewise, laws and institutions, no matter how efficient and well-arranged, must be reformed or abolished if they are unjust. So the referent for justice is a kind of analogy to truth, where the presumption is that truth entails a kind of a security, and so too must justice, as the measure against which institutions that exist in its name exercise power. Being first virtues of human activities, truth and justice are uncompromising. And yet, in this formulation, truth and justice are distinct. Truth and justice occupy the distinct territories on either side of a fact-value distinction with attendantly distinct institutions. And of course, the Rawlsian solution to the problem of justice is a kind of problem of drawing down into a kind of measure of fairness, into a construction that relies upon a basic capacity for human discernment, rooted in a kind of a self-interest, you might say. So it's a kind of economical theory of justice. So in this case, universality, the problem of the universality of justice is essentially a problem of neutralization, of the removing of particularity, the construction of the everyman, and the form of self-interest appropriate to the everyman. That is to say, in the Rawlsian story, the original position. That's also, it seems to me, both a kind of valorization of reliance upon and a fundamental distinction from the problem of truth. So of course, this is the tenability of that Rawlsian project, which of course finds its expression in various different forms, including the notion of public reason, the kind of drawing down into a space of rational neutrality as a foundation for politics. That is the problem that is the subject of this conversation between then Joseph Ratzinger and Jürgen Habermas. And this is Habermas on a kind of retreat from what was previously for him a fairly straightforward story of secularization of the public sphere, that religion has a place in public reason. We should understand cultural and societal secularization as a double learning process that compels both the tradition of the Enlightenment and the religious doctrines to reflect on their own respective limits. Here is Ratzinger. Sensibility to the truth as a necessary element in the process of political argument. So far, so good. At this point, Pilate's question becomes unavoidable. What is truth? The message of the Christian faith is never solely a comprehensive religious doctrine in Rawls' sense, but is a purifying force for reason, helping it to be more fully itself. This is quite interesting because this is an agreement with Habermas, in the sense that Habermas is opening the door to the introduction of religious views into the public sphere as a necessary moral reservoir, as a reservoir of moral imagination that enhances the capacity to public reasoning. And yet, there's something significantly different going on here. So again, what's going on here, it seems to me, is that the move to universality is not merely drawn down into a kind of expanded pluralism in the Rawlsian story, but rather there is a move towards unity as purification. So there may be a theory that underlies their intercourse, indeed is a theory, a worldview, a faith that underlies an account of the source of unity. But as a sort of political project, the project shifts from the project of neutralization to a project of purification. So let's compare this with Habermas, and here's where I'm coming to the position of science in this mapping. So Habermas, with Ratzinger, wants to say that there is a role for the voice of religion in the public sphere, right? That relationship between reason and faith should not be a relationship of separation and of segregation, as it is in the Rawlsian story, but rather as a process of mutual learning. But then when rubber meets the road, a certain amount of delineation still happens in the Habermasian account. So this is from Habermas's Holberg Prize lecture in 2005, just a short time after Ratzinger and Habermas engaged in this dialogue. Religious citizens must develop an epistemic stance towards the independence of secular from sacred knowledge and the institutionalized monopoly of modern science on what we know about states and events in the world. So he's asking for a particular kind of deference, right? This succeeds to the extent that they conceive of the relationship of dogmatic and scientific beliefs in such a way that the autonomous progress in secular knowledge cannot come to contradict their faith. So there's an account of a necessary relationship between faith and reason, but it's an account of subordination. And it's an account that's not grounded in an epistemology so much as rules of engagement that entail, that are committed, that are capable of producing a particular kind of epistemic relation between the two sides of the learning equation. Religious citizens must finally develop an epistemic stance towards the priority that secular reasons enjoy in political and social arenas. They succeed to the extent that they make a transparent connection between the egalitarian individualism and universalism of modern law and morality and the premises of their own comprehensive doctrines. What are secular reasons in this picture? That is the regulative concept. And it seems to me that that comment earlier about purification from Ratzinger is most fundamentally a challenge to this construct of the secular reason. It points to the way in which the secular reason is a production rather than an ingredient in this process of political reasoning. Okay, so a key takeaway from that is the constitutive, you might even say the constitutional role that scientific authority is playing in the constitution of the right sort of relations of citizens in a pluralistic environment. It becomes a kind of a referent, a regulative referent that sets the limits of reasoned deliberation, even in a context in which the irrational, i.e. the non-secular, the religious, is invited into the conversation. So here is Pope Benedict. The danger of the Western world is that today, precisely because of the greatness of his knowledge and power, man will fail to face up to the question of the truth. So this sensibility to the truth is a challenge that is posed by precisely the autonomy of the university as a place in which knowledge is produced, in which truth is sought after, that he has affirmed in the beginning of his speech. So let me just pause for a minute and simply sort of lay these out as axiomatic. We think of science and technology as sort of bodies of knowledge and material things that do stuff, but if we think of science and technology as loci of social authority, as social institutions, we have to recognize that they are loci and arbiters of social, which is to say rational, epistemic, moral, and political authority. They are engaged in boundary work, that is constructing, policing, and transgressing fundamental distinctions, which are supposed to describe the territories of science and non-science, fact and value, secular and religious, public and private, which is to say what is common and what is not common, what is universal and what is parochial. And they are seen as, presumed to be, progressive and, I would argue, secular or secularizing. So if we take these as sort of observations about the cultural position of science, or you might say the constitutional position of science, then I think we can see something like this in a slightly different light. So of course, throughout the pandemic, this sort of clarion call to follow the science as a kind of civic, political, even moral obligation, as a position of deference of the citizen to what was to be a regulative institution on the ways in which the citizen gives reasons for and comports with or fails to comport with collective norms. This was the sort of, this captured it all, this little phrase, follow the science. But, it's the best way to see this, it seems to me, is as a religious disposition, right? As a kind of a faith, you might say, a kind of perverse faith, a bastardized faith, but a faith nonetheless. And of course, one sees the ways in which the sort of the secular reasons are deployed in remarkably non-secular ways, maybe with irony, maybe not. I took this picture in Cambridge, Massachusetts, just down the street from Harvard University. So is this ironic or is it not ironic? But one can see this sort of all over the place. Indeed, the sort of expression of, this is from the victory party of the Biden-Harris campaign at the last election. The sort of celebration of the sort of right deference to the right deference to the appropriate authority, as a kind of a political achievement that cedes to a kind of extra political institution, a kind of political authority. These things are worth seeing. Whether it's a good deference or not is a separate question, or it's a question we could discuss. But that doesn't obviate the observation that this is a political relation. Okay, and so what does this kind of valorization of a particular kind of secular institution, one that speaks secular reasons, whose reasons are in effect secular by definition, that are exemplary of the secular, to look back to Habermas's comments, what does this give you? Well, it gives you a kind of secular formation that is grounded in a kind of pretense to, or a claim upon universality, that is also committed to a kind of a fracture, to precluding precisely the kind of relation that Benedict describes as purification, as the condition of possibility for purification. What's interesting, though, is that the problem of the world that these formations have given us is precisely the entry point that leads to the dialogue between Ratzinger and Habermas. This is Ratzinger. If we have noted the urgent question of whether religion is a truly positive force, so we must now doubt the reliability of reason. Even the atomic bomb is a product of reason. The breeding and selection of human beings is something thought up by reason. Does this mean that it is reason that ought to be placed under guardianship? Of course, this is in the wake of September 11th and concerns about the ways in which religion is a force of destruction in human civilization, a source of terror, potentially, of irrationality. But the corollary question, both of these thinkers raise this corollary question of the problem of guardianship, of governance, of that which is in other formulations supposed to be the regulative force. But by whom or by what? This is Habermas in a little book written just a little while before this dialogue, and one of the catalysts of it. Up to now, both the secular thought of European modernity and religious belief could proceed on the assumption that the genetic endowment of the newborn infant lay beyond any programming and deliberate manipulation. I'm sorry for these long quotes, but these are Germans, you know. This rather ordinary contingency proves to be, in the moment we can master it, a necessary presupposition for being able to be oneself and for the fundamentally egalitarian nature of our interpersonal relationships. In other words, in the moment that it becomes technically possible to manipulate the human, the question of the inviolability of the human loses the foundation, which was, it turns out, in Habermas's account, a kind of habit. The presumption of equality that comes from the unscripted equal place from whence all human beings have previously come. The moment that one can depart from that history, the problem of equality has to be rearticulated. And yet, where does one reach for it? Habermas's answer is, well, maybe we need to look to religion to sort of leaven the secular public moral imagination in order to sort of recover a vocabulary necessary to contend with this problem. That picture, by the way, that movie that was playing out, is just to capture the point that these things are very practical and immediate problems. That film and these little videos are from a set of experiments that have been done over the last couple of years. This is in mice. Is that playing? No, maybe it doesn't play. But if you could see it playing, what you would see are the little heartbeats of what are sort of pseudo mice. It's questionable whether they're mice or not. That's part of the problem, because these mice were assembled out of sort of artificially generated stem cell lines, co-cultured and grown ex utero in little sort of spinning bottles, up to what is essentially the equivalent of almost halfway through mouse development. The video on the previous slide was a human synthetic embryo, or a biologically human embryo-like entity produced through the same techniques that hasn't yet been taken, or at least the results haven't been published, of of it being taken up to a similar phase of development, but that work is unfolding as we speak. And so the problem of who will say what these things are, if indeed that is the problem, is a problem of, in effect, defining the human, such that the inviolability of the human and the delineation of the human from the non-human as a kind of moral problem is transmuted into a biological problem over which the biologists undertaking the work assert jurisdiction. So you can see the entanglements that are at play here. And of course, the justification for asserting jurisdiction is you can believe whatever sort of metaphysical made-up stuff you want to about the nature and moral significance of these entities. The true discourse, the true universal discourse, that which is held in common, or should be held in common, is scientific knowledge. And thus it requires the expertise of the people who know what these things are, i.e. the people who make them, to say how we should think about them and what they should mean. This stands in contrast to a statement like this: reality as a whole is a question pointing beyond itself. This is a fundamentally different relationship to reality, not because it gives an answer, but because it asks a question. The question that it asks is one grounded in an aspiration to unity, a presumption of unity, a rejection of the kind of delineation that the projects of universality that I've been pointing to begin with as a sort of presumptive step. Okay, last spot here, just very quickly. So one of the things that I think is very interesting, and one of my favorite little texts of the small number of texts that I've read, are a series of sermons that Pope Benedict gave before he was Pope Benedict in the mid-1980s, I think, on Genesis. They were very wonderful. And in this reflection on Genesis, which, as he correctly notes, is a sort of has become delimited as a sort of theological, as a locus of theological engagement to sort of dealing with the problems of, post-evolutionary relationships between science and religion, and et cetera, he discovers, or he uncovers in this text, a set of problems about the relationship between God, creation, and created, not least the human, of course, that invites a kind of aspiration to unity and an orientation to faith that begins in that place, and which in a funny way does the promise of universality more compellingly than modernity's projects of universality. So the concept of nature in the sense of the object of science takes the place of the concept of creation. This is a position of alienation. It's a position of alienation of the human from the human, a position of alienation of the human from the created order in which the human is embedded, and a position of alienation from the questions of place, purpose, telos, etc., that are attendant in a relation to creation, but not in a relation to nature. I'm skipping ahead. I'm skipping through lots of steps that he takes, but one of the most interesting observations that he makes is that in this move to alienation, which is also a move to empowerment, rather in this move to empowerment, which is in effect a move to alienation, there's also a kind of there's a dual move towards the emancipation, the authorization of self-formation, what he describes as activity, the making, the human as a project of self-making that denies the human as pre-existing her own project of self-making, which is simultaneously becomes a position of self-alienation and even of self-loathing. So this is the problem of the position of the human in a world in which the human has created problems for that world, a problem of environmental disaster, because again, this in the 1980s, in the absence of a sense of creator and creation. We sense a threat that does not lie in the distant future, but encounters us in the immediate presence. The humility of faith has disappeared, shattered on the arrogance of activity. From this, there is devised a new and no less ruinous view, an attitude that looks upon the human being as a disturber of the peace and as the one who wrecks everything, as the real parasite and disease of nature. So the emancipation, the secular emancipation of the human is in effect the undoing of the human. The last comment I want to make, and this is a sort of personal preoccupation, which is also a query to Benedict, or those of you who know his thought much better than I do. And that has to do with the relationship between worship and critique. One of the most interesting things I think that he says in the series of sermons is that the relationship of worship, the relationship to a creation and to a creator, is a relationship of worship that quickly and easily goes off the rails as that relationship of worship sort of transmutes subtly into a relationship of self-worship. What keeps things on the rails? Well, he says this, and this is from the text with Habermas, Dialectics of Secularization. The responsibility of philosophy is shedding critical light on premature conclusions and apparent certainties about what man is, whence he comes, and what the goal of his existence is. This is the necessary relationship between philosophy and theology, which shouldn't be confused with each other, but can never be separated from each other either. Philosophy must sift the non-scientific element out of the scientific results with which it is often entangled, and thus keeping our awareness of the totality and of the broader dimensions of the reality of human existence. What troubles me in this is the non-scientific element out of the scientific results, that this is a kind of a purification that secular science claims to be its own territory, and that if the measure of the scientific and non-scientific is basically a basically epistemological one, rather than a kind of a posture towards unity, well, it maybe undermines, it maybe commits itself to a theory before it commits itself to an ethical posture or to a spiritual posture, and basically opens the doors to the kinds of problems that it's sought to challenge. And so, for me, as somebody who comes from a field that tries to think about those domains of, in effect, secular authority, not least science and technology, that have come to be in modernity and position themselves through the moves and techniques that are familiar to all of us, position themselves as occupying a kind of a transcendent position. I want to ask whether a move towards unity entails a necessary kind of commitment to an ethic of critique. And so this is a little picture of the way in which, in my field of science and technology studies, the idea of a sort of methodological symmetry is a starting point for asking questions about, for drawing down claims that seek to occupy a position of transcendence into the thick, complex, historically, culturally, etc. situated domains of human practice, where the vocabularies of true and false are vocabularies that we deploy, of rational and irrational, of natural and social, of expert and lay, of fact and value, and of science and politics. These are actors' categories, so to speak. These are categories we use to map a world which we simultaneously inhabit. I'm thinking about the ways in which the asymmetrical deployment of these concepts becomes a sort of regulative foundation. For it seems to me, most, all of the things that Benedict's call for a kind of presumptive unity problematizes, maybe is an essential, can serve as a kind of a contribution to the forms of humility that aspiration to unity lives in, as a sort of both spiritual but also, I would say, epistemological undertaking. That's a little bit of an opaque place to end, but suffice it to say that if the question becomes, what is the one truth? And the prerequisite for everything else is giving the definitive answer to the question of what is the one truth, then the game is lost. But if the commitment is to a project of faith in the unity of that one truth, which it seems to me is the quite profound place that that Benedict begins from in his reflections, at least that I'm familiar with, then it is also simultaneously a affirmation, even as it is a delimitation of the significance of these undertakings that we in modernity have codified into these sorts of distinctions, which are supposed to be, for us, the foundations of the world. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Hurlbut. We have time for a few questions, if anybody is so inclined. Absolutely, please.
So thank you very much for your inspiring, both your inspiring speeches. It is very difficult to enter specifically in what you said to us, but I was wondering, what is the place of power in the discussions about the truth in the public square, or in the discussion about science and technology and faith? Let me give you an example. It's an example of today. Today in Italy, in Milano, a person gave as a gift to the local government statute, what do you say, statua? Okay.
Statue.
Because it's statute, and a mother, not completely dressed the same, and a child, and she was breastfeeding the child. This is the gift, and they asked the local government to put this build in a place, in a public space. And the local government said, no, we won't, because this is something that is not shared by everybody. Maternity can offend people that are convinced that maternity is only one of the opportunity to get a child. That's what they said, no. Well, you know, we can have a lot of discussions about faith and public square and so on, but once you face something like that, maybe there is something more to think about that, because the power is very much present in that. It's not only a matter of theoretical discussions. It's a matter of surviving in a place where, no matter how the fundamental roots are, they are strongly against any opportunity of show something which is not part of the general conviction of the power. Usually.
I don't have a very good answer. Maybe you have a better answer than me, but
I would like to take also what Ben said before, because, you know, if science is, we should answer to this. Is science descriptive or perspective? In the sense, if I tell you that there is gravity, and if I left something will fall down, this is science. But is the science forcing me to remain at home? In that sense, it's not simple a description. It's something that becomes something else in a public sphere. Well, if we make these passages according to Rawls and Habermas, without including the idea that science cannot be prescriptive without passages under the public space, we make of science a comprehensive theories in the same way. So the first passage is this one. In the name of some knowledge, you cannot make the passages on the public sphere. And of course, from what I know of Rawls and Habermas, there is a difference between, okay, in my perspective, we cannot call the perspective that is embraced by Benedict reading Rawls and Habermas secularism. It's a new form because it's not against religion, it's against one denomination of the institution. This is liberalism. So I propose the word liberalism instead of secularism for the section of the thinking of Habermas and Rawls that Benedict is offering in his reading to the Sapienza speech. Well, if you decide something in the public sphere, in the institution, liberalism say that the institution cannot be colonized by one view. But it's not the public spheres, it's the institutions that have to remain neutral. If we remain in that line, we have an answer to the question that you posed, because not everything that is offending me is against the liberalism, because it depends if it touch the institution or not touch the institution. If we remain in the first form, that is secularism, because it's a religious perspective, it cannot pretend nothing in the public sphere. But what is not considered is that that form of secularism simply historically failed. Religions simply don't disappear from the world. If you go to Islamic country, they are much more religious than before. And so the coming back of religious thinking and the religious believer in the public sphere push us to understand much more in the sense of liberalism, and also the discussion of power with science and technology is a different discussion. So coming to the ethics of technology, that is much more than a liberal art in the public square. Of course, every time that you deploy a technology in a public space, that kind of technology is a form of order, is a displacement of power. During the pandemic, at least in Italy, we got vaccination, that is actually one expression of the right to the health, according to an algorithm that was hidden behind a web portal on a public space. So that kind of technology is not neutral, because it's giving privilege to someone instead of someone else. The problem is if it remains hidden behind the algorithm and is not handled according to the shaping of power with justice. So this idea is an idea that is not in the speech of La Sapienza, because it's not the focus on the speech of La Sapienza. And the discussion among the different disciplines is not oriented to have a priority of power in the public sphere, but is the idea to not divide the knowledge, to simply remain in a form that is not a comprehensive theory. And so the feeling is science in some forms became in itself a comprehensive theory if it's moving from a descriptive role to a prescriptive one. The mediation, also in a science-based decision-making, has to be political. And because it's political, it's not the right application of science, but it's a mediation. And then we can make it much more complex, but I stop here.
So let me just respond. I try to respond to both of these comments / questions. Let me begin with the dropping of the pencil. The dropping of the pencil is exactly the sort of demonstration that is used to draw a distinction between the descriptive and the proscriptive. But someone dropping a pencil is not science. If you understand science as a social institution that enjoys a particular kind of social authority, right? And it seems to me that there isn't actually much point in thinking about a science that looks nothing like the science which is invoked by social actors in order to assert a kind of social authority when it's invoked, except insofar as they simultaneously invoke the descriptive rather than the proscriptive as a basis for marking their social authority as non-normative. Okay? So follow the science is not your pencil is going to drop when you let go of it, right? It's in a contested domain in which lives and livelihoods are at stake, and there are matters that are big P political that need to be contended with. Expertise should rule the day. That is, in effect, what that little phrase means, right? And so it seems to me that we have to be careful not to delimit to delimit a particular kind of, to reify liberalism in a way that neglects the ways in which liberalism also makes a claim on reason, sensibility to reason, to use Habermas's phrase, right? Or sensibility to the truth. We have to be careful not to reify liberalism in a way that ignores how liberalism, for its coherence, in moments where it's maybe being a little bit less coherent, like in those quotes that I gave from Habermas's Holberg speech, relies on these other sort of tacit forms of authority, right? Because those are there, and they pop up when you look for them, all over the place. And so in that sense, one can talk formalistically about pluralism, about rule of law, about the ways in which a kind of self-referential regime, a kind of self-contained regime that has organized itself around forms of neutrality that are supposed to achieve forms of universality or whatever, that are not reaching for some exogenous basis for self-justification, are actually constantly reaching beyond for some basis for self-justification. And I mean, the point there is not to unmask it and say, you're breaking the rules, it shouldn't work that way, it's not real liberalism or whatever, because of course that's, that's a kind of constant dynamic in political theory, but rather to observe that there's a need to reach. And I mean, it seems to me that the critique of a self-contained liberalism that Habermas has sort of half-heartedly and incompletely opened the door to in this kind of 2003 to 2006 period or whatever, but which Ratzinger is engaging with very directly, that's the thing to pay attention to. And, then questions of the body, questions of propriety, questions of all the questions that are at stake in the sorts of examples of which they're abundant, that you were pointing to. I mean, then those things come to be at stake in a way that we can actually see them. It doesn't answer those questions, but just saying pluralism or just saying, deliberation and its resolution through free and equal participation in a ideal speech environment or whatever. I mean, communicative rationality. I mean, these are ways of occluding, actually, it seems to me, at the end of the day, the ways in which they're reaching outside of and asserting forms of asserting forms of, well, put it this way, reaching to foundations that they simultaneously deny as foundation.
Wonderful. I hate to suggest a conclusion to this conversation. I'm also aware that we are coming up close to lunch. So would you join me in thanking our panelists again, please?